So if you like watches, the odds are that you'll also like cars. And if you like cars, there's a very good chance that you like motorsport. I mean, why else would the Swiss watch industry spend almost $500 billion in the last 5 years on Formula One sponsorship? Now, there are lots of watches that have a connection to Formula One, but the one I want to talk about today is a retro reissue of a watch from an era in Formula One where men were men and sex really was the breakfast of champions. It's a watch that pays homage to a legendary team and a legendary driver, and I think it might just be the coolest of them all. Now, anyone that knows me will tell you that I like cars and motor racing almost as much as I like watches. And since the age of 7 or 8, when the only cars I could afford were made by Matchbox, there's always been one particular Italian marque that stirred the emotions inside me more than any other: Ferrari. Now, while I've never been able to afford one, I was very lucky to borrow a Ferrari from a very good friend for my wife and I to use as our wedding car on the day we got married. Of course, seeing my wife-to-be walk down the aisle is one of the most special memories of that day. But driving away in that Ferrari as husband and wife was pretty special too. Now, Ferrari has an illustrious pedigree in motor racing, and in particular the pinnacle of the sport, Formula One. In 1975, Ferrari won the Formula One Constructors' World Championship. And while we tend to think of Ferrari as being one of the top teams in Formula One, when they took the title that year, it had been 11 years since they'd been at the top. The championship that year was decided at the penultimate race of the season, the Italian Grand Prix, at the famous Autodromo Nazionale di Monza, and that's where this watch gets its name. The winner of the Drivers' Championship that year was a certain Austrian racing driver and a relatively new signing for the Scuderia Ferrari. His name was Andreas Nicholas Lauda. Niki Lauda, as he came to be known, came from a family of wealthy industrialists, and from a young age he was being groomed to go into the family business. But the young Niki Lauda had his sights set elsewhere. During his teens, he became completely obsessed with motor racing, and he was determined to become a racing driver. He focused on almost nothing else, despite his family's opposition to it. He started out racing minis, but quickly moved up to single-seaters. But Niki Lauda was determined to get to Formula One, and rather than waiting to be spotted by one of the teams, he decided to take out a £30,000 bank loan, secured by an insurance policy, and he bought his way into the fledgling March Motorsports team, initially racing for them in Formula 2, before being promoted to Formula One for the 1972 season. Lauda was quick, but the March cars were beset by reliability problems. So, he took out another bank loan and moved to the BRM team after just one season. The BRM car also had its share of reliability problems, but after running in third place for much of the 1973 Monaco Grand Prix, the young Niki Lauda came to the attention of none other than the infamous Enzo Ferrari. Ferrari's Formula One team had been in the doldrums for much of the late 1960s and early 1970s, and after a disastrous 1973 season, Enzo Ferrari was determined to rectify the team's problems and put Ferrari back at the front in 1974. Seeing Lauda as a very talented, up-and-coming young driver, Enzo Ferrari decided to take a gamble and sign him for the 1974 season to partner the more experienced Clay Regazzoni. And it didn't take long for Enzo Ferrari's confidence in Lauda to pay off. At Lauda's debut race for Ferrari, the Argentinian Grand Prix, the first race of the 1974 season, Lauda finished the race in second place. Only 3 races later, at the Spanish Grand Prix, Niki Lauda became a Formula One race winner, giving Ferrari its first win since 1972. Lauda went on to demonstrate his outright speed by dominating qualifying, putting the Ferrari on pole position for 6 consecutive races. But while the Ferrari had pace, reliability became an issue once again, and Lauda finished the season 4th place in the Drivers' Championship. Lauda dedicated himself to working with the team to iron out the car's reliability problems and to set it up to perfection. Not only did Lauda have exceptional feel for what the car was doing, But he could convey that information back to the team, and that was really important. Remember, this is back in the days before computers and data and telemetry in the way that the F1 teams have today. Despite this dedication and the efforts of the team, the 1975 season didn't start well for Lauda, and his best result in the first 4 races was a 5th place finish. And then the turning point came. Lauda won 4 of the next 5 races, bringing in a haul of points for the team. A 3rd place finish at the penultimate race of the season, the Italian Grand Prix, was enough to give Lauda his first Drivers' World Championship and Ferrari's first Constructors' Championship in 11 years. As one of the main sponsors of the Ferrari team, Heuer immediately got to work on a new model to celebrate the 1975 Constructors' Championship win, and also to celebrate Niki Lauda's first Drivers' World Championship victory. The new watch was launched in 1976, and it was called the Monza. It was designed to be a cheaper model in the Heuer range, and it used a brass case instead of stainless steel, with a chrome-plated version and a version coated with PVD. Brass is of course more porous and it's a softer alloy than stainless steel, and the case would mark easily and the PVD coating was prone to flaking off, allowing the brass to show through. It used Heuer's Calibre 15 movement, which is a cheaper version of the Calibre 12 that was first used in the Heuer Monaco. With the running seconds at the 10 o'clock position and a 30-minute counter at 3 o'clock, it was one of the few models to have its name engraved on the case back. The Monza was discontinued by Heuer in 1978 after just 2 years. However, it was brought back in 1981, and several versions of the model were made until 1985, when Techniques d'Avant-Garde acquired Heuer. And in the early 2000s, a new Monza was released with a more distinctive cushion-shaped case. However, this model line was discontinued once again after just a few years. Then, in 2016, TAG Heuer released this limited edition Monza to mark the 40th anniversary of the Monza's debut. This one has the cushion case of the early 2000s Monza. However, the case on this model, which is 42mm by the way, is made from grade 5 titanium. It's an interesting choice of material, because most titanium watches costing less than $10,000, such as Omega's Seamaster No Time to Die or the Tudor Pelagos, will use grade 2 titanium, which is much softer and much easier to work with than grade 5, although it is much easier to mark. And whereas grade 2 titanium can only have a brushed finish, grade 5 titanium can be polished on the case, and this one has a brush finish to the bezel and polished flanks. It has a DLC coating to give it its black finish, which is diamond-like carbon, and that's much tougher than the PVD usually found on black watches at this price. In 2016, when this watch was released, it sold for about £4,500, or say $6,000. Now, I picked this one up used but immaculate for almost half of that price. And I think that this watch at that kind of money offers incredible value, especially considering the quality of the materials and the finishing. Any downsides? Well, the movement in this watch is TAG Heuer's Calibre 17, which is effectively an ETA 2894 Mark II. It's a reliable movement, it's got 37 joules, and it beats at 4 Hz, but it only has a power reserve of 42 hours. I also think that it's a shame that TAG Heuer didn't use their Calibre 11 movement, the one that you'll find in most versions of the Monaco, because that would have allowed them to put the crown and the pushers at the left-hand side of the case instead of the right, to be more like the original Monza. And while this re-release has the running seconds and the 30-minute counter subdials, just like the original Monza, because they've used the Calibre 17, those subdials have had to be swapped over to the opposite sides of the dial. Though the chapter ring does have a pulsometer and a tachymeter, which is authentic to the original. The indices have a faux patina, which is actually quite dark. It's almost a coffee colour, rather than the ivory or off-white or cream colours that you'll see on many watches. And while some people aren't a fan of faux patina, I think that it really suits this watch and it complements the deep blood red accents on the dial. I actually think that they've used Ferrari red, or as Ferrari call it, Rosso Corsa. The dial features the original Heuer logo rather than TAG Heuer, which is something that TAG have been doing for a while now on some of their vintage rear-seat watches, and I really like that they're trying to be more authentic. The caseback also has the Monza name engraved on it, just like the original. The strap on this watch is really nice. It's a rally-style strap in soft black leather, and they've also used titanium for the deployant clasp, and it feels like it weighs probably almost nothing. So back to Niki Lauda, because his story didn't end in 1975, and I think it's what happened to him in 1976 that's what made this guy such a legend. Lauda dominated the start of the 1976 season, winning 4 out of the first 6 races. By the 5th race, the British Grand Prix, he had more than double the points of his closest competitors, James Hunt and Jody Scheckter, in a championship battle that was immortalised in the 2013 film Rush. If you've seen the film, you'll know the rest of the story. But Hollywood portrayed James Hunt and Niki Lauda as bitter rivals, and certainly they were fiercely competitive on the track. But off the track, they were actually quite good friends, and they were even flatmates for some time. Lauda looked sure to win the 1976 Drivers' World Championship, and he was also set to beat the record of the most race wins in a season, which was held by the late Jim Clark and set in 1963. Quite simply, by the middle of 1976, Niki Lauda looked unstoppable. The next race was the German Grand Prix at the fearsome Nordschleife, a 14-mile-long, twisting and undulating circuit through the forest of the Eifel Mountains, and it was known as the Green Hell. By 1976, Formula One cars had been developed to the point where they could achieve the kind of speeds that were far beyond what the Nordschleife had been designed for, and the track had already claimed many lives. A week before the race, Niki Lauda drove the track and immediately called for the safety arrangements to be improved. And when this fell on deaf ears, he pleaded with the other drivers to get them to boycott the race unless the organisers provided more marshals and more fire and safety equipment. And even though the organisers didn't improve the safety arrangements, Niki Lauda couldn't get enough drivers to vote for the race to be abandoned. Torrential rain on the Saturday meant that the qualifying couldn't go ahead, so the grid places would be determined by the times from the Friday session. James Hunt would start the race on pole position, Niki Lauda would start from second. When race day came, heavy rain on the far side of the track meant that the start had to be delayed, and nearly all the drivers started the race on wet weather tyres. Regazzoni took the lead, while Hunt and Lauda fell back. The circuit soon began to dry out, and many of the drivers pitted at the end of the first lap to change to dry weather tyres. By the end of lap 2, Jochen Mass led the race, Hunt was in third, and Lauda, who had been one of the drivers to come in to change to dry tyres, was desperately trying to make up places. As he manoeuvred a very fast left kink in the circuit, the rear of the car stepped away from him, and it went hurtling into a banking before making contact with another car and bursting into flames. Lauda was trapped in the car. 3 other drivers stopped, ran to the scene and fought their way through the flames to free the trapped driver from the car, getting burnt themselves in the process. Lauda had been wearing a modified helmet. It didn't fit him properly, and the foam inside had compressed with the heat from the flames, and as he was pulled free from the car, the helmet slipped off and exposed his face and his head to the fire. Moments after being pulled free from the wreck, Niki Lauda fell into a coma. He was taken to hospital, but the burns to his head and his face and the damage to his lungs were so severe that the chaplain administered the last rites. But somehow, miraculously, the ever-determined Niki Lauda pulled through. To the amazement of the whole of the F1 world, he returned to racing just 6 weeks later, and having only missed 2 races. The Niki Lauda that had become a World Championship winner at the Italian Grand Prix in Monza in 1975 arrived at Monza in 1976 in blood-soaked bandages, and he wore a specially adapted crash helmet to avoid putting pressure on his head wounds. During Lauda's brief absence from racing, his championship rival, James Hunt, had reduced Lauda's lead in the championship, and by the last race of the season, the Japanese Grand Prix, Hunt was only 3 points behind. Hunt qualified on pole, with Lauda to start the race from second place on the grid. But when race day came, once again the heavens opened, and the rain was torrential. The dangerous conditions were just too much for Lauda, and after just 2 laps, he pulled into the pits, retired the car, and withdrew from the race, effectively handing the championship to James Hunt. However, Niki Lauda went on to be a 3-time World Championship winner before eventually retiring from racing in 1985. But while he was no longer behind the wheel, Niki Lauda stayed in motorsport, and eventually in 2012 joined the Mercedes-AMG Petronas F1 team as non-executive chairman. It's actually rumoured that it was Niki Lauda that was responsible for bringing Lewis Hamilton to the team where he's won 6 of his 7 World Championship titles. Retirement from motorsport was eventually forced on Andreas Nicholas Lauda when he passed away on the 20th of May 2019, age 70. So guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video, but before you go, there's something that I need you to do for me. It won't cost you a penny and it'll only take you a second. So please give this video a like. It'll mean the world to me and it'll really help this channel to grow. Also, 93% of people who watch my videos aren't subscribers. So if that's you, please hit the subscribe button now because there's loads of great content still to come. And if you enjoyed this video, you might like this video that I did about the iconic Heuer Monaco. Guys, as ever, thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye for now.